Hello everyone and welcome to another YouTube video. As most of you probably know, I recently took part in the World Cup in Sochi in Russia, and I came back a couple days ago, so just wanted to go over the games with you guys. As you guys can see in the first round, I played Asyl Abdyjapar, the national champion of Kyrgyzstan, and I was playing in with the black pieces. So the World Cup is always a bit of a nervous event in a sense that both you and your opponent that you prepare for like 3 weeks but eventually you face off. So it's always kind of curious to see what the other guy has prepared for you. Anyway, so my opponent played 1c4, which was already a slight surprise. I actually expected him to play the move 1d4. So after 1c4, I played the move e5, which might have been a slight surprise in return. Over the last year, I've played a lot of c6, intending to play the Slav, also e6, followed by d5 a lot. So I was hoping to throw him off a bit with the move e5. My opponent played the move g3, planning to fianchetto his bishop, and I played the move c6, which is one of the main lines. Move c6, black is intending to grab the center with d5, and there's a couple things white can do here. So first of all, white can play bishop g2. Black is a pretty comfortable game after d5, and in case white takes and goes d4 to try to give me an isolated pawn, black usually plays e4, blunting the bishop and getting good control in the center. White can also play the move d4, which is similar, but there are some extra options if I play e4 here. If white plays bishop g2, obviously I play d5, and we pretty much get the same thing. But white also has the option to play a move like d5, stopping me from playing d5, after which this pawn on e4 becomes slightly isolated, and white can try to attack with moves like knight c3 and bishop to g2. Anyway, my opponent played the third option, which is the move knight f3. And white is hitting this pawn, and it's not so easy for black to deal with that. I mean, I can play the move d6, but that's slightly passive. If white, plays bishop g2 followed by knight c3. And otherwise, I mean, I have to defend the pawn somehow. The move I played is the main move here, which is the move e4, hitting the knight. White played knight to d4. So white is basically hoping to attack my e4 pawn eventually by moves like knight c3, bishop g2, and maybe d3 at some point. So it's kind of like a Alyechin defense, if most of you are familiar with that. Anyway, after knight d4, I played the move d5, trying to get control in the center. My opponent took. I recaptured with the queen, hitting the knight on d4. So my opponent dropped the knight back, knight c2, and I played knight f6. So just a logical move developing the knight. Here there's a couple things white can do. My opponent played the move knight c3. If white plays bishop g2, delaying the development of the knight, black also has the option now of going queen h5 and going for a quick bishop h3. So in case white goes knight c3, I don't have to defend the pawn, I can go bishop h3. And this trade of bishops will be quite favorable for me. In case white castles, I can always go for an attack on that side of the board. And note that white cannot take the pawn on e4 because I will take, and I will have a double attack, hitting the rook and the knight. So that's just game over. So move orders do matter, So my opponent played the move knight c3. Now there's a difference. So I played the move queen e5. If I play the move queen h5, my opponent will not play bishop g2 because that runs into bishop h3, and I have a comfortable game. But here white can play the move knight to e3 and go for a quick queen c2, and actually this pawn on e4 is not so easy to protect because the knight on e3 is also stopping me from playing bishop f5. So this is why queen h5 is slightly inaccurate, which is why I played the move queen e5, my opponent played bishop g2, and I played the move knight to a6. Okay, so I'm developing the knight. Once again, the move order does matter here. If I were to start with a move like bishop e7, then once again white plays knight e3, and this pawn is uncomfortable to defend after, quick queen c2. So that's why knight a6, and here white's main move is the castle. However, my opponent played the move knight e3. So if white castles here, now I do play bishop e7, and I have a pretty comfortable game. A lot of games continued here with d4, and after pawn takes, either queen takes, after which black is pretty solid after a move like castles, or pawn takes, trying to go for a quick initiative with the center with rook e1 and d4. But again, white does have an isolated pawn, so in both cases black's doing pretty well. But in the game, my opponent played the move knight to e3, and I played bishop c5, which is the advantage of delaying the development of this bishop. So now white can play queen c2 again, hitting this pawn. But here I throw a knight b4, hitting the queen, and if the queen steps back, so as you see, it's not easy for me to protect this pawn. But what I do here is I chop off the knight, and in case my opponent recaptures, now I can play bishop f5 because it can no longer be taken. Yes, white does have the two bishops, but this bishop on g2 is kind of blunted, and I have good control in the center. All my pieces are pretty active, so black is a pretty good game here. Which is why my opponent played a3, stopping me from jumping with the knight. But now I have time to castle and meet queen c2 with rook to e8. I'm just protecting my pawn. So my opponent played b4, and I mean I can give up the bishop, but not a huge fan of that. In case I do that, then white can recapture, let's say with the f pawn. He's going to go for bishop b2, putting pressure on the diagonal, and you can also go like castles. I mean, just to illustrate, let's make a couple moves. Let's say here, bishop b2, with queen e6, my opponent will castle. And white is a pretty decent game here, I would say. I mean, this bishop on b2 is pretty active, and I would say the game is approximately equal. But I like the move I chose in the game, which is the move bishop d4, doing more of a central strategy and going for dominance in the center. So my opponent played bishop b2, very logical. I played bishop d7, continuing development, and my opponent played rook to b1. And here I think I chose a pretty good move, which was the move c5. So with this move, I'm putting pressure on the b4 pawn, and know that in this position all my pieces are pretty well placed, right? The queen's well placed, bishop's well placed, the knight, the rook. This bishop is alright, but only this knight on a6 is slightly off, right? So with the move c5, I'm trying to solve that. If white takes, this knight comes back into the game, and black has a pretty good game. So my opponent chose the move b5. I dropped the knight back, and he chose a4. So I just kept on making logical moves. Play rook a to d8, the only piece that was not really participating yet. My opponent castled. And I played bishop to c8. This move might look a bit weird to a beginner, like why would I undevelop my bishop, so to speak, but I give my rook, free way, make sure nothing's blocking it. So this is a common idea. So my opponent played a5, and I continued with the move knight e6, which I thought was a very good move at the time. My idea is to go knight g5 and go for some attack on the king side. However, there is a small problem. So I saw that my opponent could take the pawn on e4. I mean, now my knight's blocking the rook. It's blocking the rook. But I thought that I could take with the knight. And in case my opponent recaptures with the bishop, I mean, first of all, if white takes with the queen, I take on b2, and I'm up a piece, because if white takes, I can just recapture. And at the same time, if white takes here, I can just recapture and I'm up a rook. So white cannot do that. In case white takes this bishop first, I can take with the knight, hitting the queen, and now the rook protects this knight again, so black's winning. However, there is a small problem, which is that white can take with the bishop. I thought that I can take on b2, and in case white, so first of all, if white takes with the queen, I take here, I'm up a piece. If white takes with the rook, I throw in knight to d4, and I hit the queen and the bishop. Now let's say white takes on h7, I just stab the king over. And in case white goes, let's say queen to b1, I have to move g6, and suddenly this bishop is trapped. This is what I calculated, and I thought that, okay, this line should work for me. In case white takes, I can just recapture, or even throw in, let's say I just recapture. And in case white takes here, I can even take more material by giving a check and taking the rook on b2. Note that white does not have a perpetual, because in case of check, I can block, and I'm up a million pieces. However, let's go back. So this is what I calculated. However, the problem is that after bishop takes b2, white has the intermediate move f4, hitting the queen. And now, I have to move the queen. Let's say I go to c7. Now white has time to take with the queen. Sidestepping this knight d4 move, because in case of knight d4, white can play a move like bishop d3, for example, defending the pawn, sidestepping the attack of the rook. Black still has pretty good compensation, but white is definitely fully in the game. So this is what I missed, but fortunately my opponent missed it as well. So he played the move h4, stopping me from going h5. I had some pretty cool ideas. Let's say my opponent would go bishop a1, I wanted to go knight g5. In case of h4, I was looking at stuff like knight h3 check. Obviously, this trade is pretty good for me because all the light squares around white's king are weak now. And in case of white goes king h1, here I was looking at sacking the knight and taking on g3, and it looks like white's position is just collapsing. Because this is falling, bishop e5 is a pretty nasty move. So black should just be winning here. In case white goes king to h2, I was looking at, let me think for a second. I think I was looking at bishop takes e3. And in case white recaptures, I have to move knight to g4. In case white takes, I have knight takes e3 with a discovery attack, now in the queen on c2. So it's pretty understandable that my opponent played the move h4, stopping me from going knight to g5. And after the move h4, I played the move g5. I want to open up his king. I also had the move knight f4, which I considered for quite a bit of time. I thought that if he takes and I recapture, white should be getting checkmated here, because I have the idea of going bishop e5, but things might not be so simple after a move like knight a4. And now if I go bishop e5, it gets taken. And if I take here, white has knight takes c5, undermining my bishop. White shouldn't really take on d4. In case I recapture, I mean, I'm down a piece, but this knight is hanging, and if it were to move, then knight g4 is just lights out. White just getting checkmated here. So, but g5 was a good move, and here white's in a tough spot. Either he can let me take and soften up his king, or he can take himself, but then the same stuff happens. I take with the knight's hopping into h3, and white's in huge trouble. For that reason, my opponent played h5, trying to get his king side closed. But here I had a pretty cool move again. I played the move knight to f4, boom. So this knight I'm putting pressure on white's king. I mean, first of all, I could maybe take this pawn at some point, or go like knight h3. So my opponent decided that this knight cannot stay on the board, and he took it. I recaptured. So once again, I'm down a piece, but this knight is hanging. And if white decides to be greedy with a move like knight to c4, I thought white was getting checkmated after queen to g5. Bishop h3 is a major threat. And in case white moves the king over, now I take here, king steps back, and knight g4, and it's just checkmate. White's just getting absolutely destroyed. So because of that, my opponent decided that he could not allow this. He decided to sacrifice some material back. So I take, he takes, I take. I mean, I don't want to go for some sort of attack, but after queen to g5, white plays queen f3, and his king is now suddenly pretty safe. In case I take, he recaptures, and who is attacking who now? It's black who's in trouble. So because of that, I took, he recaptured, I took the bishop, and he played d3, hitting the rook, played rook to e5, keeping an eye on this pawn, and giving me the option of sliding the rook over. So my opponent took on d4, I recaptured, and he played knight to g2. Note that white absolutely has to bring defenders towards his king. In case he goes, let's say, knight to c2, just getting checkmated after check, check, check. In case the king steps up, I always have bishop g4, and the king has to step back, and I take here, and everything just collapses. And in case the king steps to the h file, then rook to d6, and it's just checkmate. So for that reason, my opponent played knight to g2. He had to keep peace around his king. And up to this point, I played a pretty good game, but here I started losing the thread a little bit, which was quite unfortunate because, like I said, it had been a pretty good game so far. And I was looking, for a way to finish the game, but I couldn't quite figure it out. So my first intention was to move bishop to h3, and with the idea of going rook to h5. And I thought that in case white goes f3, I have rook takes c2, hitting the knight. White has to go rook f2, I trade, and then this very strong move rook to b4. Now I hit the rook, and in case the rook moves, I have rook to b2, and white has to go here, but he's just completely pinned. I can just go king g7, collect everything. So after rook b4, white has to take. I recapture. White has to take here, but I push. And white has to stop this pawn. So he has to go knight e2, b2, knight to c3, and here I have a very nice move. I have to move bishop to e6. Bishop f5 doesn't, have the same effect as white had king e3 and he's in time to stop the pawn. With bishop e6, king e2, bishop a2, very nice idea. Okay, so white goes king e2 is just not in time to stop me from queening, and black's up a piece and he's just completely winning. So I saw this line and I wanted to go for it. But the problem was that after bishop h3, I thought that white has to move king h2. And I can take on h5 and everything's looking pretty good, but now suddenly white has to move f3. And I kind of figured that if I don't have something direct, my pawns are kind of split, and there's a chance that this, could dry up somehow. So I saw to move rook to d5 with the point that in case white takes here, I can take, and my rook is protected, so here I just win. But the problem was, I became slightly worried about, I think it was rook to h1. And once again, things are not so simple. If white gets time to go king to g1, my pawns are a bit weak. But black has to move rook h6. And I thought the problem here was knight takes f4. And in case I move the bishop, white always has king g3. But here black has to move bishop to f1, blocking the connection between his rooks. In case white goes king g3, I move this rook over first, saving it. In case white goes here, I take, and I'm up. In case white takes here, I'm up in exchange, and black's just completely winning. Let's say I take here, and I don't know, bring the king or something. So that was kind of unfortunate, and that made me lose the thread a little bit. I played the move f3, which was still pretty good. He took rook g5, played king over, I took king back, and I played bishop h3, intending rook g5. My opponent played f4, blocking the square, and I played rook to h6. I go rook g6, pin the knight, and win the game. My opponent played the move b6, which was a tricky move. Because here I cannot just play rook g6, because now he will take, and I mean, if I take with the rook, he steps the king over, and I cannot really stop this pawn. If I go rook to d8, he has rook takes b7, followed by rook to b8, and suddenly it's black who has to fight for a draw. So I didn't want to allow that, so I played a takes b6. He took, I played rook to d6, so I'm hitting this pawn. Note that does not have time to defend it, because in case he plays rook to b1, I rook g6, and this knight is lost. So my opponent played king to h2, I traded the bishop for the knight, and I took here. So I'm up a pawn, and white has doubled pawns. So this endgame should have been, easily winning. So white played rook to c1, I played rook to c6, king f3. And already here I started making a couple inaccuracies. So I played a move king f8, which is fine, but I could have also just started pushing here. But the king f8 is fine. He played king e4. Once again, I think the easiest way to win this position is just to go h5. Just push this pawn up the board, eventually put the rook behind, and I mean, I have a couple passers, white has none, so this should have been an easy win. So I played the move b6, my opponent played d4, and here I really missed an easy win, which is the move c4. Once again, I have my rook behind the passed pawn. In case white goes d5, I just go, let's say, rook c5. And the problem for white is if he moves the king over, I just go c3. And he can never take, because this pawn endgame is just completely lost. Because, I mean, I can put my king on d6 just to be safe, but eventually I'm going to push this up the board, and I'm going to push this up the board, and white only has one king, so he cannot stop both the pawns. So this is just a very easy win. And there's simply nothing white can do. I mean, he does not have to take the pawn, but that means that his rook will have to stay passive. Here, just bring him the king, and it's just game over. But I played the move check. He went king to d5. I took. He took. And so we reached a time control. And things are not that simple. But here, for some reason, I couldn't, figure out that I just have to push this pawn. The right way to proceed here would have been h5. But I thought that, white goes, let's say, f5. I go rook to h6. And white can go king e5 and try to create counterplay with f6. But the problem for white is that he's never in time. Let's say I just push f6. So white is threatening checkmate. So don't just push your pawn. Always look out what is my opponent trying to do. But I can just play a move like king e8, sidestepping, If white gives a check, I just go king d7. And in case of rook f8, I can play rook h7, stopping all sorts of counterplay, and I'm just going to push this pawn to victory. If white goes, let's say rook c7, I just push, and if check, I can just move the king over. White can take, but it's just white's just way too late. I'm just going to queen. White can try king d6, creating some last tricks, but I guess the easiest way here is king e6. Making sure that I don't fall for a checkmate. That would be a dumb idea. Don't do that. So, yeah, those so h5 I feel like was a very clean win. I played king to g7 because I didn't want to allow my opponent to get a pawn to f6. So he played f5, hitting the rook. And here I started to realize that things were not that simple. So I was intending to move rook to e2, but suddenly I realized that he was going to go rook to b1, let's say, and if I take king e4, for example, and it would be quite likely that we could get some sort of endgame where he gets this pawn and I have the h and f pawn, which can very often be a draw. Black still has pretty good chances here because the white king is cut off, but if this king makes it to the g file, then it's generally a draw. So because of that, I played rook to e8. My opponent played rook to b1, and here I should have played the move rook to b8, just defending the pawn. But I was a bit worried if my opponent would play, let's say, king to e5, once again trying to do this. And if I go f6, he has king to d6, I thought. And if I go b5, then king c7 suddenly. And I cannot keep protecting this pawn, so I'd have to give it up somehow. But still, black has pretty good chances to win here. But I wasn't able to switch from going to a cleanly winning endgame into going for a position like this, where it's probably still winning, but it isn't, as clear cut anymore. So that would have been a better try. I could have also played king f6, and in case he takes, let's say I take here. So I thought this would be a draw after, let's say, rook h6, but actually, if I go king g4 and white takes f5, and believe it or not, even though materials equal, black's winning. Because this king is cut off, I'm just going to step this king up, go f4, and there's nothing white can do. If white could somehow, if this rook was on h3 and white had rook e3, it would have been a draw. But here white's just too passive. In case he goes, let's say rook f7, I just go f4. Let's say white sits. I go king f3, for example. If king here, I go rook e2, and I'm going to go after this pawn. And eventually black should win. Because this king is cut off, my king's pretty active. And there's a whole bunch of endgame theory involved here, but this is a win at the higher level. But the move I chose was kind of weird looking back. I played the move h5. He took an h4. Now, the problem for me here is that my king is cut off, whereas if I would have played king f6, my king would have been active. So white should not play a move like rook b3, stopping my pawn, because here I go king f6, and it's basically just game over. If white goes here, go king g5, and white just lost. I'm going to bring my king up the board and push my pawn. So my opponent just decided to sit, which was the right decision. I played h3, pushing the pawn, and here I played rook to b1, the correct move. King f6, and rook to h3. So now, if I take, and he takes, and I go king g4, white has time to go rook e3, and it's just a draw. If he goes rook h7, that would be a big mistake, because I go f5, and he's suddenly in big trouble again. But here, once again, since the rook is on h3, he can just swing it over, and it's just a draw. So either I trade rooks, or I let white's king come back. I played rook h8, defending the pawn. My opponent played king e2, king g5. This was the last thing I could try. He played king f3, I played king h4. And now the position isn't that easy for white. So in case white goes rook h2, just waiting with the rook, that would have been a big mistake, because I go, let's say, rook to a8. If he steps the king back, now I start checking him. And I don't know if this is necessarily a loss, but it's very, very dangerous for white. And it could easily be a loss. But my opponent, and white also kind of play a move like rook g1, because here I go h2. After check, I don't go here, because white keeps on checking, but I go here. And white cannot stop the pawn like this, because I take it, and he also cannot play king g2 because that hangs the rook. Here white simply cannot stop me from making a new queen. So it looks a bit tricky, but white has the move rook c1, which is what he played. Rook b1 is also fine. Rook b1 is a draw, rook c1, rook d1, and rook e1. I guess just any square that enables white to, give a check on the fourth rank. The problem for me here is that if I push, white goes king g2 and stops the pawn, and it's just a draw. I play rook to g8, trying to cut off the king. If I get one more move, I can go h2 and I'm winning. But my opponent gives a check, I go back, and he goes back. And once again, the problem is if I push, he goes rook h1, and I'm not in time. It's just a draw. So I repeated the moves once. Rook d1, I played f6. He just waits. I repeated the position again. Rook g5, but he just keeps on sitting, and there's nothing I can do. So I took here, he played king g3, king g6, rook h1. I gave a check, he took, but after king f5, it's just a draw, because he just blocks me from coming forward, and after rook g3, we agreed to a draw. Very unfortunate start. Like I said, I played a pretty good game up to, I would say up to this point. It's been a pretty alright game, and normally I would just convert this rook endgame very. I was very disappointed that for some reason I wasn't able to do it. But yeah, so the first game of the first round ended in a draw. Hope you guys liked the video. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment, leave a like, and we'll see in the next video what happened in game 2. Alright, see you guys.